right. Hello there, everyone. It's great to be with you today. My name is John Lustria. I'm the Director of Education at the National Museum of Civil War Medicine, and I'm thrilled today to be joined by Dr. Sarah Purcell. Welcome, Sarah.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Today we're going to be talking about her recently published book, Spectacle of Grief, Public Funerals and Memory in the Civil War Era. So it promises to be a very interesting conversation. I know I'm looking forward to it, and hopefully you are as well. So we're going to jump into that conversation in just a second. See, we've already got a number of folks tuning in. It's always great to see and hear where you all are watching from around the country and in some cases around the world. Before we jump in, of course, if you want to support this video and any of our videos, an easy way to do that is just hit the like button. The more people like it, the more people comment, the more people share, the more engagement the video gets, and it gets bumped up to the top of the ratings and the algorithms and all that good stuff. So the more that you share and like and comment, it helps boost the video a little bit. So that's a easy, simple, free way that anyone that's watching can help us out if you enjoy our videos. So I really appreciate that. If you want to take your support to the next level, consider becoming a member of the National Museum of Civil War Medicine. Memberships start as low as $25 a year. That's just a couple dollars a month. So you get a lot for that, including free admission to the museum for an entire year, discounts in our gift shop, and our journal and newsletter that go out, and so much more. And of course, the knowledge that you're supporting programming like this. And we really appreciate all of you who signed up to become members over the past several years. It's meant a whole lot to us and allows us to continue doing what it is that we do. I see we got a number of folks tuning in. We've got Ryan from Colorado, one of our members, which is always good to see Ryan in the comments. Got Edward from Kissimmee, Florida. Fernando from Venezuela, another of our regular viewers, Becky from Austin, Texas, Lynn from Chicago, Diane from New Jersey. I'm here in Frederick, Maryland at the museum. Sarah is out in Iowa. And remind me of the town again?
It's Grinnell.
Grinnell, yeah. Iowa, that's right, thank you. So we're all over the country and all over the world here. So I'll note one last thing, folks, if you have any questions during the program, please put them in the comments and we'll do our best to get to as many questions as we can. So with that said, Sarah, I wonder if maybe you'd introduce yourself to our audience, say a little bit about how you came to the field of Civil War and 19th century history.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it. The book is coming out April 12th. So in a couple of weeks, everyone will be able to get their hands on it and see it. I came to this work, interestingly, through both prior scholarship and through my teaching here at Grinnell College in Iowa, where I've taught for 22 years. So I got my PhD at Brown University, and I originally was focused more on early Republic history, so the 1790s through the 1820s. And a previous book that I wrote was on the public memory of the Revolutionary War. It's called Sealed with Blood. And it looked at how the Revolutionary War became a part of U.S. national identity and how the public memory of that war really shaped the early United States. And so that involved a lot of things like monuments and celebrations and 4th of July, things like that. So as part of that, there were a few important funerals in that book, especially George Washington's funeral in 1799, funerals, I should say, but also several others. So that sort of planted the seed in me of looking at the idea of funerals as an aspect of military memory in the United States and how important it was. Also, I've been teaching U.S. Civil War for 25 years, my entire career. And so I got more and more interested in that and the connections between U.S. Civil War memory and memory of the post-revolutionary era, kind of looking at the longer 19th century. And the more I delved into that and really looked in my scholarship to connect the Civil War and the post-revolutionary period, the more I got interested in. I've written, a number of other books, and am interested in both cultural and political history and military history. But the memory of warfare and how important it is to the U.S. and national identity is kind of at the heart of all of my work, and I just have connected it through various lenses, looking across the kind of longer 19th century. So that's how I got into this, and I've been working on this project for a long time, more than a decade. And so it's a long haul of research, and it's nice to see the book coming out now. I can say more about why funerals are important, but that's kind of the connection of looking to there's a lot of scholarly and public conversation about Civil War memory, right? Everything from the role of Confederate monuments, even some Union monuments, to battle flags, and memory is a really important aspect. I think we can all see that in our current day. And so I'm trying to look at that through the lens of these public funerals, how they help to create the memory culture of the US Civil War, and then also connect that to some larger themes in how the United States, different people approached the national identity and a sense of belonging to the United States from very different, sometimes completely opposing angles, and just kind of using this framework of these public funerals. That's what I'm really doing in the book. So.
Yeah, the history of memory, especially Civil War memory, has also interested me for quite some time as well. So I'm excited for this conversation. And that's incredible, a project, 10 plus years in the making. It's amazing. And I have so much respect whenever you hold, especially a work of, historical monograph that you hold in your hands, just knowing the amount of time that goes into producing that. And obviously you weren't working sun up to sundown for 10 years, but it's, you've been plugging away at it, here and there for quite some time. So that's amazing. And it's also, I like asking that question, how people came to a certain project, because I think it's so interesting that so often it's sort of an amalgam of a bunch of other things they were kind of working on, and it all sort of comes together in this newly formed entity. So I always like hearing about that.
Yeah, especially when, I sort of have you have the cocktail conversation. You tell people you're a historian, and you say you're writing a book, and then people say, oh, what's it on? And so then I would say, funerals, and you kind of see like the color drain from people's faces and kind of wanting to know, probably not unfamiliar to some exhibit goers at the museum, right? Some of the people go to the grisly details, but I think because I had studied this earlier period, I was sensitized to the way that when George Washington died, all over the country, there were mock funerals, there were sermons, there were all kinds of celebrations, and that was really significant for the founding era of the United States. And so once I was attuned to that, and then I was looking at the Civil War era, I started to see how important it was. And then probably the most famous funeral that most people have heard of is Abraham Lincoln's funeral, maybe Ulysses Grant's funeral as well, but Abraham Lincoln's funeral in 1865, after his death, it was probably the largest public funeral and had several aspects. But there's a lot more to the story. His was not the only significant funeral. And so, and in fact, Lincoln's funeral couldn't have taken place without some of the precursors that my book also examines. So it turned out to be a very fruitful way of looking at some really meaningful topics in Civil War history.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. We have quickly in the comments, we have Charles from Minneapolis, a former funeral director, and he says how much he enjoys the history of how we mourn. So I think Charles, you'll get a lot out of this.
Absolutely,
today.
Charles, that's so true. The mourning is a really, really important factor, both private mourning, family mourning, religious mourning, but in the case of the case studies that the book looks at, the more public aspect of mourning, and is really a way for people to work out their feelings about a whole host of issues in politics, in American culture, and even in some very fine details, like, what the caskets look like, things that are very, that wouldn't seem to be as culturally widely important as they are. People like Charles know that they're important, right? Funeral directors certainly pay a lot of attention. And even the rise of the modern funeral director sort of sector of the economy, all of that stuff kind of comes out of the post-Civil War experience. So yeah, thanks for linking up your own profession to that larger theme of mourning. It's definitely important.
And it's definitely something we're keyed in on here at the museum. A, for obvious reasons, but B, of course, the building in which I'm in was, during the Civil War, a furniture making shop as well as the local undertaker, because, of course, coffin making is what gets you there. So it's right in our wheelhouse as well. So as you've settled on a topic, of course, as you're getting ready to put this book together, talk about maybe some of the sources you consulted for this, and maybe any that surprised you on the journey.
Yeah, there are a lot. Probably the number one source, or not probably, definitely the number one source, is newspapers and other print culture. So hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of newspaper articles, probably thousands of newspaper articles, magazine articles, posters, kind of ephemera, pamphlets and books. Really tried to immerse myself in the news coverage of funerals, because these funerals that I'm looking at are for significant individuals like Frederick Douglass or Robert E. Lee. And the news coverage was part of the story. It's actually part of the whole culture of the funeral, because the press would follow usually the death of the person and then all of the funeral arrangements. In many cases, the bodies and the mortal remains of the person maybe traveled from one area of the country to another, sometimes on a special train. And so the press coverage itself played a huge role. And in the 19th century, of course, newspapers were also the sort of precursor of social media that we have in the 21st century. People interacted with the newspapers, they shared them amongst one another, they wrote letters to the editor, they did a lot of interacting with the press. So thousands of newspaper articles are the kind of number one source. It's possible to trace, where bodies were traveling, what people thought about them, excerpts from eulogies, all kinds of both praise and condemnation sometimes of the individual who's being buried, depending on where you're looking or who's doing the writing in the newspaper. That newspapers were not neutral in the 19th century. They were very partisan and took a lot of sides on social issues. So it's a great source for that sort of thing. Then, of course, all the available letter and paper collections of various individuals covered in the book, many papers at the Library of Congress, a little bit at the National Archives, and then lots of other archives and special collections all over the country. In some places, that's where you have to go for the newspapers. Not everything is digitized. I did a lot of work with actual physical newspapers, but also private letter collections. And so I would say those archives are probably the place where you find the most surprising things. You asked about, what's surprising. So for instance, I was doing research at it was then the Virginia Historical Society, and I think now is the Virginia Library of History and Culture. And I was looking at a collection of letters of condolence sent to the widow and oldest daughter of Robert E. Lee, so Mary Lee and Mary Custis Lee. And it's literally hundreds of letters that were sent in, spontaneous letters of mourning, of condolence, but they always had a kind of public aspect. They often were from, colleges, boards of trustees, baseball clubs, churches, and really all over the country, not even just from the South, also from northern locations, former Confederates living in Detroit, like all over the place, sending these letters and letters. And they were very fruitful for part of the argument about Lee's mourning and Lee's public funeral, and the kind of private grief, public grief, the way they were connected in his case, and looking at gender. But then once in a while, you find something that you're really surprised by. And so in that collection, lo and behold, you open the folder in the archive, and there's a sealed envelope that was sent to his daughter, containing, as it says on the envelope, berries plucked from the coffin of Robert E. Lee. And so it's an actual floral offering that was on Lee's coffin that's sealed in an envelope and has presumably, I think, been sealed since it was sent to his daughter. And you're kind of there holding the actual closed envelope sitting in the vault that has these berries. And it's a kind of physical reminder. Sometimes it's those pieces of material culture, the real artifacts. And I know you know this from the museum, right? That really give you that sort of shock of recognition of something you've been reading about and interpreting in print culture, and then to kind of see an example. And that this was something that was then saved by the family as an important item. And it's certainly the kind of thing too, in Lee's case, where if that had become public, that's the kind of thing that might have almost been treated as a relic of Robert E. Lee, because the Lost Cause has a lot of veneration for Lee, and his heroism is kind of at the center of that. So it has a lot of political meaning. There are other aspects like that, mostly from archival collections, where you kind of open something up and you'll see a physical remnant of what you were talking about. There are other examples, but I'll share a northern example to balance that out just quickly. So the second chapter opens with the funeral of Elmer Ellsworth, who was one of the first Union officers killed in the Civil War in May of 1861, and in part, it's kind of a dramatic scene where he was removing a large Confederate national flag from the top of a hotel. And then he was killed, and the innkeeper who flew the flag were both killed in this altercation. And then Ellsworth's blood stained the Confederate flag that then played a role in a lot of these elaborate funerals, mourning celebrations for Ellsworth. And I was at the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library and Museum in Springfield, Illinois, doing research, and there was a letter from Francis Brownell, Corporal Brownell, one of Ellsworth's aides, who actually shot the hotel keeper, from one of his relatives to the Ellsworth family. And you open the letter, and there are actually shredded pieces of cloth from the Confederate flag, stuck through a slit in the paper. And so I've been studying this. A lot of the chapter talks about how physical relics, the meaning of these flags, the way Ellsworth's body is associated with nationalism. And actually James Jackson, the hotel keeper, the same for Confederate nationalism. They're kind of twinned martyrs. And there's a piece of it stuck in this letter. A number of museums claim to have pieces of the flag, but this was like very verifiable and a very personalized piece of that. So those are the kinds of things, I think, where you find something associated with the actual funeral, the mortal remains, the kind of rituals of celebration and commemoration that, tell you you're on the right track, but are also very surprising.
Yeah, I can't imagine how I might react in that situation. Just boom, suddenly there it is.
Yeah.
And that's a great point too. And this was a conversation that, history folks had a lot during 2020, during the pandemic, when, almost everyone was at home on a regular basis. The joys of programs like this, where we can, go out and see certain battlefield sites or have conversations about things. But at the end of the day, there really is no substitute for going to the site and, seeing the material culture. There's really nothing quite like that, which is why not just, museums like ours, but, historical societies and archives around the country are really so important. They're preserving that material culture for folks to continue to look at and experience and learn from. So that's awesome. I love that you highlighted that. This is maybe a little bit of a silly question, but I can't help but wonder, was there like a certain criteria or threshold in order for someone to have a public funeral for them? I mean, do you have to, back in the 19th century, did you have to have a certain number of followers on social media?
Yeah, that's it's a good way to think about it. They have
what was
the
that?
blue check verified. Yeah. I think that, it's a really good question. So the phenomenon of the really big spectacle funeral, it really got launched, okay, so I mentioned George Washington, 1799, but even that was still a lot smaller than most of what happens in the 19th century, partly because of the press technology and the spread of newspapers that I talked about earlier. And it really gets launched in 1852 when Senator Henry Clay died. And that's actually the first chapter of the book. Even though it's a precursor to the Civil War, it sets the pattern for a lot of the later funerals, both kind of who merits this high level of praise and also the kinds of things that happen. So the remains going on a kind of a tour with more than one public funeral, this immense press coverage, the use of flowers, and the use of technology like the telegraph to spread the word of, well, the body's going through Louisville and in the morning it'll be in Lexington. And so everybody gather on the riverbank and we can tip our hats simultaneously as the church bells toll. You couldn't have done that in 1799 because you couldn't communicate simultaneously, right, across distances. And also even just the use of railroads, steamboats, there's a lot of technology that goes into this, let alone things like embalming that become more important in the 1860s onwards. So Clay kind of sets the pattern. And if you think of George Washington as the precursor, it tends to be people, and I will say men, the first criteria is to be a man who is a very important, seen as an important and powerful individual. There isn't like a committee that's deciding this person gets, you get a public funeral and you don't. And there are lots of other public funerals that aren't covered. So, you know, people like the Grimke sisters or Henry Ward Beecher, there are cultural and social activists who have funerals in the 19th century that are public, maybe in their state or in their town. You know, we all have seen sort of dignitaries on a local level. You might think about now, maybe when police officers are killed, for instance, that there's, you know, people will line a highway or when remains are returned of a deceased soldier. There are important deaths for a municipality or for a state. But these are people who have kind of a celebrity factor and a certain amount of power. I will say it's interesting because it is spontaneous. There's nobody that's like planning this, that nobody could turn their funeral into a national spectacle on purpose. There are people who argue over the meanings on purpose and what they think about these funerals. So senators, I will say generally it's senators, military leaders, and then by the 1890s, one of the points of the book is that it changes a little bit and starts to open up at the dawn of the 20th century, because the last chapter focuses on Frederick Douglass, who also then kind of breaks the mold of these public funerals. He died in 1895. He's the first Black man who is really accorded this level of public mourning. And also Winnie Davis, who is the daughter of Jefferson Davis, 1898, the only woman included in the book. And really, there are a few more women in the 20th century. Clara Barton actually had quite a large funeral when she died and had a lot of coverage. But it's more in the 20th century when women start to qualify for that. And Barton died in the 20th century, of course. So really a powerful leader, kind of the usual suspects. Once in a while, there's someone who you might not expect. One other case study in the book, which might be surprising, is a philanthropist named George Peabody, who is not known today, I don't think, is not a household name, maybe outside of Peabody, Massachusetts. But Peabody was immensely, immensely, immensely wealthy. He lived in England for most of his career, but he was kind of like one of the most famous Americans in England. And he gave a lot of money. He's a precursor of Andrew Carnegie and the sort of late 19th century philanthropists. And he gave a lot of money to Confederates to try to post-Confederate states and especially educational institutions to try to reconstruct the South. But because he was a famous son of New England, he was also very important to Robert E. Lee. He had a lot of connections to Robert E. Lee. And because he lived in England, his funerals, I'll say, he first had a funeral in Westminster Abbey in London, and then was transported across the Atlantic and had huge funerals in New England, where he was buried to lots of press coverage. it became a kind of drama about Anglo-US relations and whether they could be repaired after the British support of the Confederacy, which was informal but very significant, and about sort of Northern forgiveness of post-Confederates in the South. And so it becomes, he is a surprising person to us, but at the time he was like super, super wealthy and important and famous. And he became this kind of symbol of all of those things. Yeah, but other than that, it's mostly military leaders and political leaders. And I guess you would say like Frederick Douglass, social activists, abolitionists, that sort of person. You had to be famous to begin with. You weren't going to become famous just through your funeral. Even Elmer Ellsworth, he had been famous before the Civil War because he had organized basically a military drill team, and he was something really a celebrity before the war started. So.
What a fascinating story with George Peabody in particular. Sort of, a guy back then, sort of famous just for being rich, more or less.
And there were a few people, at least a couple of newspaper articles kind of pointed that out. Like, why should we care about this guy? Isn't this a lot of money and fuss to be spending on someone who is just rich? But that was a kind of tiny minority opinion, the kind of critique of all the pomp and circumstance. But in part, it's also because he was beloved of Queen Victoria on top of everything else. So then I think the US was kind of like, well, we can't let Queen Victoria have the last say. We have to, prove our American.
Right. Yeah, we can't let England show us up here.
Exactly. That's exactly what happened. Yeah. And they did it with the funeral. So go figure.
Yeah, there you go. So yeah, that's all very fascinating. You just briefly touched on this, and Abby has another good question about sort of the regional differences in public funerals, which I think we're going to speak to later. But Diane asked, how did they preserve the bodies for transportation? I think embalming was still new technology at that time. Was there a difference between public figures and the common soldiers that were shipped home? By which I think I mean, did they know this person was going on like an extra long journey and we gave them a little extra juice?
Yeah, this is one where, that's a great question. This is one where these prominent figures are actually important, and some of what happens with them trickles down. Sometimes it doesn't. The other thing, the reason these funerals are important, of course, which is interesting, we haven't touched on this yet, is because of the mass scale of death in the US Civil War. And in a way, the mourning for most of these individuals concentrates people's grief, and they get to put a lot of time and attention and even resources into the funerals for these individuals. And they kind of stand in for the enormity of loss of, hundreds of thousands of other individuals who oftentimes were not able to be given a very good burial or were not able to be sent home. Many bodies were moved right after the war. People were missing in both the South and to the North. So that is definitely the case now. But preserving the bodies, that's another place where Henry Clay helped to set the pattern. So not in the 1850s, embalming was not yet as common, not as practiced. And this is where coffins come in. Clay was actually put into, at the time, a Fisk patent coffin, which is it was a cast iron coffin modeled on an Egyptian sarcophagus, and it's sealed airtight. And the idea was that it was like a vacuum seal and it would preserve the body. And it had a glass window where you could move it to see the person's face. The short answer is it didn't work all that well. So, but you mentioned the furniture. I love that it's a furniture factory furniture store that the museum is in, because the Fisk's coffins had an extensive advertising campaign based on the fact that, look, endorsed by all the senatorial committee that followed with Henry Clay's body. And we all know that he traveled around hundreds of miles on trains and boats and carriages. And look how well the Fisk patent coffin did. Now, what they didn't say is that the seal kind of failed. And by the time he got back to Kentucky to be buried, they actually couldn't open the window anymore because it wasn't working to preserve the body. So it's a really good question, and one that people were really, really interested in, because people wanted to see the bodies and often interact with the remains as a way to kind of pay their respects to that person, whether they were lying in state or if just like passing by on a train. In the 1860s, more of the people that I look at started to be embalmed. Ellsworth was embalmed, for instance, and actually Thomas Holmes, who embalmed Elmer Ellsworth, kind of made his, you can see a commercial aspect here, made his reputation as an embalmer also on the fact that
from the man who embalmed Elmer Ellsworth.
Exactly. Exactly. And he did a lot of other embalming during the Civil War and kind of helped to popularize embalming. So a lot more people are embalmed, but there's a lot of attention to how well were they preserved. Yeah, definitely more. Most of the other case studies after 1861, the people were embalmed, but they did also continue to use these airtight coffins as well. And they didn't necessarily always know, well, they did actually plan ahead, like, okay, this Frederick Douglass is going to go from Washington, D.C. to Rochester, New York. And that's part of, by the 1890s, embalming was much more common. And so, but in your question, I think the original question also was about the common average soldier in the Civil War. Most of them were not embalmed. Many of them were not even individually buried, right? There are lots of mass graves at various battle sites. Even though lots of families did try to recover their loved ones, some of them tried to embalm their loved ones. It did help with the rise of both embalming and the funerary industry, but that doesn't mean that because of the crisis and disruption of Civil War, that those bodies could be treated with that respect. It's another aspect where maybe people were kind of projecting some of their respect for the dead onto these prominent individuals as a way to kind of cope with personal or familial loss.
Yeah, of course, in a war that sees lots of death, just as you were saying, I mean, embalming certainly, it's increasingly common during the Civil War. And it's my understanding that there were some shipping and or railroad companies that wouldn't transport soldiers' bodies if they weren't embalmed. So there were,
that's right.
Yeah, there were some, kind of requirements on that, but exactly so. It's certainly not all.
I mean, in the battle aftermath, nobody had time to be, trying to find the best airtight coffin or depending on, it's different if you're an officer, of course, as always in warfare. So that's part of it. There are also there's some regional differences per Becky's question. So, the train services, the many areas of the Southeast are much more disrupted by being proximate to the battles as well. And also the resources of the Confederacy were increasingly short, although taxed in northern areas as well. And so I think that, and that comes out even in the public funerals, that there's a little bit more of a struggle for some Confederates to mount this kind of funeral apparatus than for Northerners, but they still have a whole heap of memory and material culture, and then after the war, Confederate memory blooms. But in the war years, it was difficult for Confederates to do that. There are also other kinds of differences. So the influence of different religious traditions, or definitely some differences in Frederick Douglass and Winnie Davis's case. So there are lots of things that kind of give a little bit of a spin to various examples.
Oh, that's so interesting. It's funny. I wasn't even thinking about that in terms of like logistical differences where you went with that. I was thinking, of course, and how they're commemorating the figures, region, and what meaning they're assigning to this, and all, which I think now is a fine time to kind of start talking about that. So the way that your book is framed, you focus on these 9 notable funerals. Maybe talk about some of the ways, we've been kind of dancing around the bush a little bit here. Maybe talk about some of the ways these funerals were used, commemorated, politicized, and whatever else, because this is really kind of the heart of what you're talking about.
Yeah, so the funeral, it's not interesting because it's a funeral, but it's interesting because it was, as I said before, a way for people to project, either celebrate or project their values onto a particular person who's being mourned. There's a long tradition going back to ancient Rome of public funeral orations and funerals as a time to praise the dead. And so that concept is important in American culture, and it gets crystallized in these very massive public spectacles. And so they really go to the heart of arguing about the Civil War, what it was about, how it should be fought, and then afterwards what it had meant. And some very specific battles. So take even the earliest case I talked about, Henry Clay. There's all this concern, what's going to happen now that Henry Clay is dead? He was known as the Great Compromiser, and kind of people's anxieties about the Union potentially crumbling even by 1852, strains on the Union, and looking to Clay's death as a potential harbinger of the crumbling of the Union. And then alternatively, you have abolitionists who say, no, this is incorrect. You should not be mourning for Henry Clay. You should stay home from that funeral when he comes through your town, because he is an evil slaveholder who kept the United States as a slaveholding nation through his compromises. And now that he's dead and buried, we should forget him and move on. So that is, an early example, but you can see people, fighting over the issue of slavery and its relationship to Union and national politics over whether they ought to properly mourn Henry Clay or not. Is it proper to even go to one of these public celebrations or go listen to a sermon about Henry Clay or not? So it's about the values of politics and culture and very, very important issues for the day. And the same is true of all of these cases where really important things. One thing that's really interesting, though, is that part of what I'm trying to do in the book is show how all of these competing ideas. So Henry Clay is a great man, a great compromiser, or no, he's a horrible slaveholder. That very conflict is actually part of what U.S. national identities are made of, and that funerals, even though they're actually supposed to be, because it's a funeral, a very positive gloss. You don't usually stand up in an obituary, or at least in a live obituary. Sometimes in newspapers people did, and talk about what was wrong with the person. You talk more about their virtues and try and make them a positive, kind of heroicizing the individual. But then through this process of dissent, people get to have their public arguments. It's also a chance for people to, it's almost like a form of what we might call a culture war now, kind of arguing over the memory of that person. It's not the funeral so much per se as the actual memory of the person and their relationship to the various issues. That goes on through the period. So an interesting thing is both Confederates and United States during the war, they're drawing on this national tradition, right? That arguing over these important people is an important way to define what you think about the nation. And Confederates are trying to support the Confederacy by doing that, by arguing over Stonewall Jackson, or later on Robert E. Lee. They're trying to make those men into Confederate heroes. But once the war is over and the Confederates have lost, it's actually a way that some of Confederate memory gets back into U.S. national identity as a whole, because the arguments, and the rituals of mourning for Confederate heroes as they continue to pass away after the war is still a part then of American culture. And both the Confederacy and the United States were drawing on this tradition of funeral rituals. And so it's sort of like the funerals helped people to deal with being ripped apart, and then it takes the remnants of the war and keeps them active in the post-war period. So it's not that U.S. national identity is really consensual, even though funerals are kind of a consensual moment. It's actually that the identity is framed in people's arguments about how someone should be remembered.
That's fascinating. I know how sometimes even, individual funerals, even though you would hope it would be sort of a uniting thing, but sometimes they can be a bit contentious. And, certainly on a national scale with as many millions of people that think however many million different viewpoints, it's no small wonder that they were contentious at various points.
Right. And I think it's unfortunately not hard for us today to appreciate this, that death can be politicized, right? Think about mass death almost 1 million Americans have died of COVID. And it's incredibly politicized. Even just the count of how many people have died of COVID is politicized. And what should happen to mourn them or not. I think we're actually kind of avoiding collective mourning to a large degree now, but you get the point. Like today we can understand that. And so think about that only related to the politics of the US Civil War and issues about race and slavery and state power and you name it. There, money, as you pointed out before, lots of different issues get wrapped up in this way. And so it's actually a good way to look at those arguments because when a sort of heroicized or villainized person passes away, it's a time when people express their opinion. It's a big event and people express their opinion and there's a way for them to do so. And so it kind of turns public this cultural battle over what that person might have stood for.
Yeah, it's a convenient and sort of an obvious opportunity for people, the nation over, to kind of put pen to paper or talk about their thoughts about public figure X, Y, or Z. So yeah, that makes a ton of sense. Popping over to the comments, a few kind of quick questions. One from Michael Schaefer, who has spoken here at the museum before. Hello, Michael. Thanks for tuning in. He asks, did you encounter cases of soldiers' bodies being packed in ice for transportation home? And I'll quickly say to that, we have here at the museum a coffin that has a special container at the bottom that is purpose-built to hold ice at the bottom. So while I myself have not run across any kind of specific instances of that, I know there were coffins of the period that were manufactured with that in mind. So
yeah, it's definitely the case. I think Drew Gilpin Faust in her book, This Republic of Suffering, talks about soldiers' bodies being shipped on ice. I don't think any of the particular like super famous people that I'm looking at were packed in ice. They tended to use either embalming or this more kind of airtight coffin. But I think that's because those were the expensive methods that you used on famous people. And the ice was more of although ice was very expensive too, right? And it could be very expensive in the 19th century. But yeah, I think, but it's definitely, it was definitely one of the techniques that was used for more commonly.
Charles also mentioned, this is, I think, a great point, that music was a very important aspect of famous funerals. As soon as Ellsworth died, composers quickly composed funeral marches and parlor music telling a story. It brought death into the homes of those who wanted to show their patriotism. And, further, he goes on to comment about the music that was composed at Lincoln's death. So yeah, the role of music kind of as a further, I hesitate to use the term pop culture as it relates.
No, it definitely was. I mean, Charles is right. And people could show their allegiances, both by singing the song, but also by having the sheet music on the piano in their parlor. I mean, it's one of the most popular forms of pop culture in the 19th century. And that's again, starts with Henry Clay funeral marches, lots of engravings, very similar to the covers of sheet music. There's music composed for almost every one of the big public figures in the book. Funeral marches are particularly popular. Frederick Douglass' funeral march. You could buy the sheet music. You could think about what that would mean to have a picture of Frederick Douglass displayed in your home and singing a song in tribute to Frederick Douglass. That's incredibly different than the Robert E. Lee funeral march. You're not going to see both of those in the same home. There are different meanings, and that sheet music can crystallize that, I think, for people in their homes. And really, I mean, it seems almost counterintuitive, but you're absolutely right that this was a form of popular culture, not the actual death itself, but all of the things spun off around. There are many, 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 many kinds of popular culture, some of them much stranger than sheet music. So, people naming their horses after these figures, portraits, both elaborate artistic portraits, commissioned statues, all the way down to like cheap statues that you can buy to decorate your home, handicrafts that are entered into state fairs around the country. So like all kinds of things, from kind of the most highbrow memorial to a very lowbrow, common, very circulated form of pop culture.
People do some interesting things. There's no question about that.
And it's not, the subcultures is not a new invention. People in the 19th century also had their passions and almost like fandom for particular individuals. Now we would call it that, but it was very true in the 19th century too.
And one final word about music, if you're interested in kind of learning more about that, we've had Dr. Catherine Bateman on a few times to talk about music in the Civil War. She's done some really incredible research. And one little factoid that just blew me away when she shared it with me on one of our programs, that there was, I think she said, 11,000 different original pieces of music composed just during the Civil War itself. I mean, that's just mind-boggling. And now, I should also note, you said most of it's actually quite terrible, but and we don't remember most of it. But
a lot of times it was things that were adapted, so people would already know the tune, they would know how to sing it, and then it's to the tune of an old Methodist hymn. But now the lyrics are Ellsworth's Avengers. Let's join up with the war, and it seeks to galvanize people to the Union cause, and it has a politicized effect. Or it's kind of seeking a politicized effect, and people do think it had an effect to try to whip up your passion and get you to go enlist, and so it's using a tried and true theme, right? Using that old tune, but has a new lyrics to suit the occasion. So music is very powerful. Yeah,
absolutely. So there's a lot of work out there that has been done and is yet to be done about music in the Civil War. So if you want to learn more about that, you can scour our Facebook page through some of our old videos or on our YouTube channel. So there's some great stuff on that. Now, Sarah, I know you mentioned This Republic of Suffering by Drew Gilpin Faust, which is a really fantastic volume. Something actually that Robert in the comments said just a little bit ago, how much he enjoyed that book. And that relates to one of the questions I wanted to get to. So of course, one of the big things that Faust talks about in that book is the good death, dying at home surrounded by your loved ones. And, there are a lot of beats, common beats that get to be followed. And I was curious if during these public funerals, did these same beats of a good death and the commemoration, did that play out, say, maybe on a national scale? What's the relationship there?
Yeah, I think it's definitely an important theme. It's really important for really the whole history of mourning in the 19th century. And the good death, the whole, right, like you said, the notion of people having a kind of resolve at the end of their lives and being with family and being able to be put to rest in a way that's especially comforting, especially in Protestant culture, Protestant American culture. It does play out in the national scale. I think kind of related to what I was saying about embalming too, that in some cases, especially during the war, but even after, there's a way in which these figures kind of stand in for a lot of other loved ones who may have been lost, whether to the war or even, in the case of Frederick Douglass, ancestors lost to the violence of enslavement. There are lots of ways, right, in which death, it was a huge factor, right, in all of these events and these politics. And so the notion of being able to mourn and process the death and assign it a social meaning for these individuals is an aspect of wanting that good death, which maybe or probably, given the war, you weren't able to achieve with your loved one. And in fact, there's a lot of evidence of that. So Ellsworth is we'll go back to that example because he's right at the beginning of the Civil War, before the disruption is so huge, and when a lot of people still think it's going to be quick and bloodless, right, or low amount of blood. They kind of the scene of his death, it's made the subject of a very famous and popular Currier and Ives engraving, like the moment where Ellsworth and his aide shoot the innkeeper, James Jackson, and he shoots them back. The moment of death was something that combines aspects of the good death and a previous notion of public figures' deaths being important. Like, it's important to capture the moment of death. You can see that also these kind of bedside engravings of Abraham Lincoln during his death, right? They focus sometimes on the shooting, but more on the moment of death, right? So this Currier and Ives becomes important. Ellsworth wrote a letter to his parents, a last letter to his parents, and that becomes public. They publish excerpts of the letter in the newspapers, and even some of his, he talks about, if I die, I've died for a cause. Kind of ambiguous what that is. Probably he meant the Union, the cause of the Union, and referring to himself as in a biblical terms, as a little sparrow. That gets excerpted and sold in popular culture again. His last words to his parents on commemorative envelopes, which are a very popular form, right, of called covers, right, popular culture, pictures of Ellsworth, but this kind of lore about his family, his fiance, who was a Midwestern woman named Carrie Spofford. Lots of stories about, how she was dealing with it. So stories about how the famous person's family dealt with their death, kind of giving them this sense of resolution, even though in reality he was shot in the hallway of a hotel. And then he also had been a law student of Abraham Lincoln. So Lincoln was very personally affected. And then that's part of how his funeral became so important. He got a funeral at the White House because Lincoln gave it to him, and then it kind of went from there. So it's sort of like, when you have the president standing in for the family, and you can publicize these aspects of familial lore, that's important. You can see the same thing, that same chapter. I also look at the funerals for Stonewall Jackson in 1863. And again, he died really from what we would call friendly fire, right? He was shot at the Battle of Chancellorsville by Confederates accidentally, who mistook his party for a Union cavalry attack. And he lingered for a number of days afterwards. But there's a lot of press coverage of, how's he doing today? He's coughing. Oh, his wife has rushed to his side. And his famous last words are very important. And they weren't important just because he was famous and militarily important. They were important because of that. But because I think it was a sense of this, like the Confederate good death. He was a very, very strong Presbyterian, almost, seen by some as a religious fanatic. And so that notion of kind of the infused religiosity, the family being present, if possible, or if not possible to be right there, that they might have had this letter home. They were definitely seeking those aspects of the good death, but that each of these people kind of becomes a good death for whatever cause they're made to represent. And it takes on a kind of political meaning that I don't think, Faust definitely looks in her book at how that kind of mourning contributed to the formation of the state. So the ability of the United States to actually count the dead or, account for the missing. Excuse me. So the United States has power as a government to do these things. And what my book does is look more at the cultural political power, the symbolism, the arguments in newspapers, the arguments about monuments, those kinds of things. So it's very complementary to that examination, and it's complementary to a lot of the private grief that you see kind of blown up on a public scale. Does that make sense?
Very much so. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Sort of, well, that's been kind of one of the themes, I think, of our conversation, is how not only are these public funerals kind of important in the sense that people are assigning meaning to the lives of these important figures, and especially in the context of the war, what does the war mean and all this sort of thing, but also how in many ways they're stand-ins for people in a war that's seen unprecedented, gruesome death very far from home, that maybe this is a way that people can mourn some of their loved ones. So I think that's a theme, and that just further underscores that. Another question here from the comments, which I think is a good one, from John, who says, do you see any linkage of the importance of Civil War era funerals and the establishment of U.S. national cemeteries, and how burials and reburials were conducted during the war and immediately afterward? And I think that makes an awful lot of sense. I mean, the Civil War sees an incredible pivot point in how Americans think of and understand death. Obviously closely linked to death are funerals, cemeteries, burials, etc. I'm sure you probably have a lot to say about that.
Yeah, well, I mean, respect for soldiers who are willing to sacrifice themselves for the nation is kind of one of the bedrock foundations of U.S. national identity, now stretching back to the Revolutionary War. It's really part of the notion of the American Republic that people who are willing to sacrifice themselves for the Republic deserve that respect. And national cemeteries are an outgrowth of that idea, right? That because, as we talked about so much earlier, all those people couldn't be directly buried, they needed to be given that respect as having sacrificed themselves. What's tough, however, is in a civil war, there are also Americans, right, who sacrifice themselves to separate from the United States, to preserve slavery, to et cetera, all the things. It's very difficult because both sides are Americans. And of course, national cemeteries, until much later, really only started out burying Union soldiers. You do see some linkages, and there is a concomitant effort, of course, by ladies' memorial associations and other post-Confederate organizations to repatriate the bodies of Confederate soldiers and bury them in places like Hollywood Cemetery in Richmond, Virginia. And what you find is, what's interesting is the way that I think that those national cemeteries, so I talked about the way you just said, how average grief and sort of personal grief sometimes gets projected on these individuals, but I think it works the other way around too. It's a process that's reciprocal, and those cemeteries show that. So for instance, right, I mean, the Gettysburg Address, right, is at this address at the dedication of the Gettysburg National Military Cemetery, and it is seen as, right, this address that really defines mourning, gives it a meaning, gives it a political meaning, if not a politicized meaning. I mean, it's a very general statement of the valorization of sacrifice. And it doesn't talk Lincoln didn't exactly specify what that sacrifice was, I think, to make it massively applicable, right? As applicable as possible. The same thing happens at some Confederate burial sites. So the anniversary of Stonewall Jackson's death becomes the date that many Confederate memorial associations use for Confederate Memorial Day. And they use that to dedicate graves, to decorate average soldiers' graves, and they kind of are linking it to the glory of Stonewall Jackson and his military prowess and his religiosity and his heroism, for the Confederate cause. It's so complicated, though, because they opposed each other, right? This is the problem with the U.S. Civil War. The war was about viewing each other as extremely bad guys, but the rituals of death, sometimes they sometimes they fire people up to continue opposing each other, but as the after effects go on, they also have this effect of just making it seem like a kind of generic sacrifice, right? Sacrifice for the country that maybe somehow even included Confederates who were fighting against the United States. So it's a really culturally complex, and it's part of how, right, the post-Confederate memory actually becomes a potentially toxic part of U.S. public memory too.
Yeah, it's to borrow from Monty Python, of course. At some point, it becomes, well, let's not bicker and argue about who killed who.
Yeah, I thought you were going to reference a dead parrot. I was worried there for a minute. No, it's okay.
Yeah. Whenever someone says, to quote Monty Python, that can go in any number of different directions.
Okay.
But no, that's a very good point, and one that I think it's important not to lose here. Is that, as the conflict's going, they serve to, just like you said, kind of fire people up, but at a certain point there's sort of an exhaustion with all the death, and at a certain point it's like, man, I mean, a lot of people sure did die, and that's sort of one of the big
and David Blight and other scholars of Civil War memory have looked at the way that this kind of, by the 1890s especially, there's this kind of, and especially Nina Silber, other people have looked at, by the time of the 1890s, that there's this kind of general sacrifice that let bygones be bygones. But also part of the problem is, by the 1890s, it's very clear that the Black population is being left behind and being forgotten. So there's a lot of forgetting that goes on as well in order to have that kind of reunification. at the end of the century.
Absolutely. Well, as we're coming to the end of our time here, I wondered if maybe you could give some final thoughts about sort of what your hope for the book is. You know, when someone picks up a copy, what do you hope people take away from it?
Yeah, I mean, I hope people take away just thinking in a complex way about how Civil War memory and how sort of heroicized individuals really function in American society. Sometimes to create strong political ties, but sometimes to make political ties that create trouble for the future, you know, and to, as I said, some things get remembered and some things get forgotten. And so to kind of see how that takes place, even in places you might not expect it, like a funeral. And I also think right now, as I mentioned with COVID-19, I mean, I think grief and public grief and mass death is actually, you know, unfortunately with us again. And so it's important to understand how that can have really deep cultural and political consequences. And, you know, even if people aren't trying on purpose to make it so, that the United States has a long tradition of building itself up and tearing itself down over these terrible political issues, but actually that death can cause people to have to reckon with those in a particular way. And so I think whether you're, you know, interested in Elmer Ellsworth, or whether you just think that the kind of politics and culture of the United States and all of the kind of fights that we've been through are interesting and dynamic, and you want a new way to look at it, I think that either way, there should be something in the book that's possible. Yeah, so University of North Carolina Press, and April 12th it's coming out. So you can pre-order at any bookstore or online seller of your choice, or at the UNC Press website.
Yes, thank you for adding that, because Becky asked where she might get a copy. So great, you've addressed that. Yeah, one of our big missions here at the museum is doing our best to connect the past to the present. And, you know, with all of this, you know, Civil War talk that we do here, because that's what we do. It was a long time ago, certainly, but while it might be a long time ago, we're big proponents that it certainly has a lot to say to some of the things happening in the present. And I think you did a really excellent job of kind of drawing that through line there.
Thanks, John. I really appreciate it. And I think, you know, that what your museum is doing is super important. So I look forward to being able to come in person and leave the state of Iowa and come and travel there sometime and meet you in person.
Yes, well, we look forward to having you. Well, that brings us to a close here. Thank you all so much for tuning in. It's always a joy to be with you all, you folks in the comments. Thank you for asking really, really good questions. If you want to support the museum, a great way to do so is to just like this video, share it, or if you don't already, to follow us across our social media. It's Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, Twitter, and all that, all those fine places. Great way to stay up to date with what we're doing. If you don't already like us on Facebook, that's the best way to get notified whenever we go live and do one of these videos, which we do about one every week. So there's always something happening on the channel here. And if you want to take your support to the next level, consider becoming a member of the National Museum of Civil War Medicine. We really appreciate it, and it helps us continue to do stuff like this. Next week, I believe we're back next Thursday. It's going to be a pre-recorded conversation I had with Dr. Lauren Thompson about birth control in the Civil War era. So that was, I think, a really, really good conversation. So get excited for that. That'll be coming next Thursday, same time. And until then, this is Sarah and I signing off. So thank you for watching, everyone.